Joanna Cherry at the SNP conference, and I was particularly interested in the yet-to-be-decided impact of the most recent case you were bringing specifically against Boris Johnson. That's hanging over his head like a sword ahead of the Ben Act.
Well, I think it's very significant that it's hanging over his head. The purpose in bringing the case was to try and clarify that there wasn't some way for Boris Johnson to weasel out of what he's required to do under the Ben Act. And the result of bringing the case has been that he has had to give an unequivocal statement to the court that he will comply with the Ben Act, and importantly that he won't seek to frustrate its purpose. So all this nonsense that's been floated by people like Andrea Leadsom about sending a letter asking for an extension to Article 50 one day and then sending a letter the next day saying we didn't really mean it, or making a phone call saying we didn't really mean it, that would be to break the undertaking that he has given to the court. And the court have been very clear that if the Prime Minister was to renege on what he said, that would be a matter of the utmost seriousness. So in the light of the promise that the Prime Minister gave the court decided they didn't need to make any formal orders. And in that situation, you would normally expect the court to dismiss the case, but they haven't dismissed the case. They've seen fit to hold it over until the first working day after the 19th, remembering the 19th is the day when the Ben Act obligations kick in. We can, if we want, go back to court on the 21st of October in the same court process if the Prime Minister breaks his promise. And I think the fact that the court have been prepared to do that and to set time aside for us to come back shows that they must, in their minds, have some doubt as to whether Mr Johnson will keep his word.
For people that have never followed these types of legal cases before, is that normal for Scotland's highest court to have a suspicion that government legal officers, the UK government, might have been misinforming the court?
No, I mean it would be a matter of the utmost gravity if the Prime Minister said one thing to the court and then did another thing. And Lord Pentland said it would completely undermine the constitutional relationship between the Crown and the courts. And of course we would be able to go back to court, perhaps have a finding that Mr Johnson is in contempt of court, which could lead to a fine or imprisonment, but more importantly we could ask the court to find somebody else to send the crucial letter asking for an Article 50 extension.
So the consequences of that could be quite severe. You mentioned prison there, so there's a possibility that Boris Johnson could end up in Barlinnie.
I think that's highly unlikely. I know a lot of journalists have fixated on that because it's a good story. The Prime Minister could go to prison. I think that is unlikely, but nobody should underestimate the seriousness of the Prime Minister breaking the assurances he's given to the court.
And finally, there's obviously a really significant constitutional principle at play here. The autonomy of the Scottish court system goes back prior to the Act of Union, is preserved in the Act of Union. What would that symbolise if the UK legal officers were misinforming and breaking their oaths before the Court of Session in Edinburgh?
Well, it's been reported that the only reason the Prime Minister gave those assurances was because his law officers, the Attorney General in England and the Advocate General in Scotland, told him that he had to. If the Prime Minister breaks those assurances, those law officers would have to resign. If they didn't, I can't really envisage a situation in which they wouldn't resign, to be honest with you, because remember, the law officers are lawyers and they have professional obligations as well as political careers.